Good day, this is Terry DeFazio, and you're watching Dial It Up. Today, my guest is Greg Nagurney. He is the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor for the State of Vermont. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tell our audience briefly, well, even not briefly, take as much time as you like. What does your job entail, and what is the scope of it?
Sure. So I'm employed by the Department of State's Attorneys for the State of Vermont. And the Vermont State's Attorneys have available to them a grant from the federal government. It's administered by the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, more commonly called NHTSA. And what the grant does is pays the salary of a state's attorney who specializes or dedicates all of their time to traffic safety laws. In Vermont, we call those Title 23 laws because that's the book where all our traffic safety laws are.
Oh, okay.
And the majority of what I do, since the majority of our traffic safety work in this state revolves around DUI work, that's where I find myself. I also do some work with police agencies. I do trainings or educational work for them to give them continuing education credits, or just to give them refresher courses, things like that. And I also, depending on the season, spend some time in our legislature answering questions legislators have about bills and what effect it would have on the law, what effect traffic safety, what effect a legislative initiative would have on traffic safety. So, I advise on changes or legislative amendments they're thinking about making.
So, Greg, in your opinion, in Vermont, are DUIs going up or down, and why do you think that is?
I shouldn't say we, I should say Department of Public Safety and the Agency of Transportation. So my partners keep great data. They have a system called the FARS system, which is Fatal Accident Reporting System. And they track all of Vermont's crashes and the data that's associated with them. So for example, are they belted or unbelted? Was alcohol involved? Were drugs involved? And the answer is DUI, it's a big part of what we do, and it tends to stay fairly steady with respect to alcohol-based DUIs. This year, I think we're on track to have more or less the same numbers we've seen. Where we're seeing growth in the area of DUI is in drugged driving offenses.
Okay.
And we are seeing a fairly regular linear uptick in those each year. The first year I'm aware of data for, I think we saw I think 50 cases, 60 cases, and this year, maybe it was 75, but this year we're on track to, go in the area of about 200.
And would that be all drugs or one specific?
Drugs are defined under our law as anything that affects your ability to drive safely.
Which is any of them and all of them?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I always have people say, oh my gosh, if I drink 4 cups of coffee and I'm jittery, am I going to get a DUI? And of course, the answer to that's no.
No.
Those aren't the kind of cases. But we have officers who are specially trained to look for drug drivers. And those are, there's typically 7 different types of drugs, but it's the ones you would expect. It's, stimulant drugs, depressant drugs, marijuana, LSD. I mean, illegal drugs, typically, things that we think of as regulated illegal drugs.
Is there any one drug other than alcohol, which has been a problem for years? Is there any one that seems to be sticking out over and above the others?
The 3 that we see the most in Vermont are depressant drugs, so a lot of the benzodiazepine type drugs.
Yeah, Valiums and things like that.
Sure, things like that. Opiates, both heroin and then OxyContin, oxycodone, those sort of things. And then the third one that we tend to see the most of is marijuana. Other states don't have the combinations of drugs we do. For example, PCP is a commonly found drug in a lot of other areas of the country, or methamphetamine. There's a lot of DUIs based on those type of drugs, and we don't seem to have those here. Our big three seem to be depressants, opiates, and marijuana.
Yeah, and when I was a drug and alcohol counselor at the prison here for 4 years, and I remember one specific case. This guy had drank, I think, maybe 6 or 8 beers, smoked a couple of joints, and ended like 7 or 8 Valiums also.
Right.
So, and it turned out to be a DUI fatality, gosh, way back in, I think it was 1990 or whatever.
Wow.
But in your opinion, you led me to another good question here. Right now, the legal limit for impaired driving is .08 BAC. Mm-hmm. Do you think that should go down, or do you think it's okay where it is?
Well, I know that the National Transportation Safety Board, which again is an arm of the NHTSA organization for the government, has recommended an 0.5 BAC. Your question gets, I think, to a point I was hoping to make, which is that, we see a lot of folks we typically do prosecutions for alcohol use or drug use, mm-hmm. But we do have a statute that allows overlap, which is a combined influence of alcohol and drugs.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, that one has proven difficult and time intensive to enforce. So, for example, if somebody like the guy in your situation, if he had a number of beers and his BAC was over an 0.8, likely the officer who responded to that would be faced with a crash scene, would have all the confusion and mm-hmm. Demands on his time that went with that, would see the 0.8 BAC and would likely just stop there, because that's enough information to allow him to investigate this as an alcohol-based DUI.
Right.
What that misses is all of the people out there who have a few beers and smoke a joint, or have 3 beers and take a pill, leftover oxy from the time they got a root canal or something like that.
Which is not a good idea.
Right, and so what we had proposed last term in the legislature, I think it was a proposal from Representative Grad from Moortown, from the House Judiciary Committee, mm-hmm. And it was also from Commissioner Flynn from the Department of Public Safety, Keith Flynn, he's from the area.
Yep.
But the proposal was to have a bill, and it would have been a companion piece to the marijuana initiatives we were seeing last year. But the idea would have been to have an 0.5 BAC plus any detectable amount of THC mm-hmm. Be one of the things that could trigger your criminal liability under the DUI statute. And the reason for that is there's a lot of research out there that suggests that while marijuana is less impairing than alcohol, mm-hmm. In the sense that your crash risk at 0.8 is greatly increased. I think it's a factor of 4 to 5 mm-hmm. or more, and your crash risk while using marijuana is only, I think, 2 or 3 times. We say only because alcohol is so much worse. But there's what's called a synergistic effect. So when you combine the alcohol with the marijuana, that amount of marijuana that you're used to having when you're pouring a few beers on top of it changes things drastically, and it makes you much more impaired than either your BAC or your amount of marijuana use would suggest. Yeah,
the synergistic effect, I'm glad you brought that up. The way I used to explain it, and this is a rough way of explaining it, is 1 and 1 equals 3.
Right.
You get them both combined together, and you've got almost like a slingshot effect.
Correct.
As to how impaired you really are.
Correct.
Which is tremendous. I will never forget one story a guy told me that he was driving stoned over in Burlington, and he went onto the off-ramp, and he said it seemed to take about 2 hours to get to the end of the off-ramp,
right.
Because he was so stoned. And another guy said that he was driving and he kept slowing down. He knew he was speeding. When the cops pulled him over, he apologized for driving too fast. The guy said, "This is a 50 miles an hour zone. You're going 20."
Right.
And that's what marijuana does, and people don't realize that this is not a good idea, is it?
It distorts your perception of time and distance, which are two of the most important things anybody can have a good perception of if they're trying to drive.
Exactly.
And paradoxically, I'm seeing a lot of cases, and police are seeing a lot of cases where people are shown to have marijuana in their system, and they begin by, the cases all start not with someone driving very, very slow, but somebody driving fast, sort of to compensate for the fact that they feel like everything's going very slow, and so then they overcompensate by driving too quickly.
Yeah, and that is kind of a scary business when you, I don't know how you feel about the legalization of marijuana. In my take is that you're going to solve some problems, you're going to create some new ones. Anybody and everybody should understand you shouldn't be taking this stuff, any of this stuff, if you're going to drive, really.
Yeah, I get accused of having a lot of positions on that topic within the legislature, and you know, I've never said anything on the subject other than, if marijuana is legalized, these are the challenges, these are the things we're going to see. I think as you said, I think it is an impairing substance. I think that we have a conversation that misses the mark because we frequently talk so often about how it's not as impairing as alcohol. And the problem with that comparison is that alcohol has a measured dose. Everybody knows 0.8's the magic number with alcohol. Right. Marijuana doesn't really work that way. Edible products are popular in other states that sell marijuana. There's a constantly varying amount of THC in a brownie or in a piece of candy or chocolate or something like that. A Budweiser is a Budweiser is a Budweiser, and everybody knows what its effect on you is going to be. Who knows what that brownie is going to do? And as you said, I think the real answer isn't, moving aside from the issue completely, the real answer is just don't use the substance, whatever it is, and drive. Our law has a really plainly defined standard for impairment. For alcohol, it's impairment to the slightest degree. So if you're feeling like you've been drinking, that's a good reason not to be driving. And drugs are very much the same. The standard is that safe operation is impaired to the slightest degree, and if safe operation is impaired even to the slightest degree, that's a problem and you shouldn't be driving. Yeah,
and some people who drink have a very high tolerance, and they may not be feeling it, but they're still impaired.
Right, and that's why 0.8 is the limit for alcohol, because there are certainly people, and I've seen them even come to court, where they've been drinking and they're actually quite drunk, but just they're so habituated to the alcohol that they can function pretty normally at a 0.15 or a 0.2, and you would never know they were impaired just to see them as a person on the street. But the fact of the matter is 0.8 is the limit because the studies that everybody agrees on have shown across the board that you're impaired at an 0.8.
Yeah.
Even if you hide it.
And another thing that people don't understand, of course, it has to do with how your body metabolizes alcohol.
Right.
But after 2 drinks, you're probably going to have a 0.02 or 0.03, and that alone affects your prefrontal cortex, which is the center for higher reasoning.
Right.
And a guy has a couple of drinks, or a woman has a couple of drinks, and they say, "Oh, geez, there's that 900-pound gorilla over there. I'm going to go pick a fight with him," because their judgment is impaired. And in my estimation, any sort of alcohol in your system when you're driving is not a good idea, and I would like to see it lowered. I remember one time, as a matter of fact, in 1990, the state of Texas had a BAC limit of 0.15.
As recently as 1990.
1990, wow. And you know how they got them to change the law? The federal government said, if you don't change it down to 0.1, we're pulling all your money.
The federal highway funding, sure. Yeah. Your point about the lower BAC, we have some of that in our law.
Oh, good.
And so, for example, if you have a commercial motor vehicle, so anything over a 10,000-pound gross weight, so think about, something with more than 4 tires, a delivery van, a semi, something something like that. The limit there is 0.4.
Oh, wow.
And if you're driving a school bus, it's 0.2. And so, I think people recognize your concern when they set lower limits like that. And I guess further to your point, and the thing I've wondered is if 0.2 is not all right to drive someone else's kids around, why is it okay to drive your own kids around?
Well, I can't argue with that. And as a matter of fact, I didn't know this, but I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's something that should really be looked at. I know that I haven't drank for 21 years, and I would not dare get behind the wheel of a vehicle of any sort after 1 drink. Especially now, I'd probably fall asleep at the wheel. What agencies do you work with mostly, and which ones are the good ones to work with?
Police agencies?
Any agencies?
I spend most of my time, I shouldn't say that. I work more or less statewide, but I work I was going to say most of my time with the state police because I feel like they have a greater coverage range. So I think they're just disproportionately represented. But I have cases right now in this county with a Newport officer from the Newport Police. I have cases really statewide, so sheriff's agencies, Vermont State Police, local municipality police agencies, and even the occasional case with a DMV inspector or somebody like that. So it really kind of runs the gamut.
Yeah, so you do a lot of work with the state police then.
Well, the state police sort of have a disproportionate representation in DUI enforcement because they're on the road a lot more. I mean, there's officers in Burlington, which is largely just a foot patrol kind of a jurisdiction. I mean, who don't get DUIs, hardly at all, just because of the nature of the work that they do out in the field. Troopers tend to see more of them just because they're on the road so often. And then I work with the VSP a lot, just in the sense that they house and oversee our alcohol testing lab, so our forensic lab that tests the drivers. And so I often have work relating to VSP's job on that front.
Is there any specific county where you tend to see more impaired drivers or drunk drivers?
No, it's fairly evenly spread, and I think probably just by population, as you'd expect. So there tends to be more of them in Chittenden County just because there's more people there, more police agencies. And there tends to be less of them in the more rural places just because it's less likely that you'll be out on the road and encounter an officer if you are drunk.
Yeah, that would make sense. I was wondering if anybody ever kept statistics per capita.
Yeah, absolutely. There is data that's available from the lab, I think, showing which of the specific testers that they use get the most use throughout the state, and I think they know the busiest day of the year just from their data and things like that.
Okay. Now, do you coordinate or share information with other states regarding impaired driving, drunk driving, et cetera?
Yes, the federal government is really into the idea of data and data making. Basically, your decisions as law enforcement need to be justified by your data. The phrase they always use is data-driven. And so we have somebody at the Agency of Transportation who specifically keeps all the data that the federal government requires. And there is somebody at the level in Washington, D.C. who looks at that data and would say, well, why do you want more money for this resource when, the data shows that your problem is really over here in this place at this time. So, yeah, there's good data sharing going on just as far as the federal government and the state as far as enforcement efforts.
Well, that would make sense because if a person picks up a DUI or two here in Vermont, that probably should be shared if somebody does the same thing in New Hampshire or Maine or New York or Massachusetts, correct?
Yeah, and when you do a criminal background check of somebody, so after a person is arrested on probable cause for a DUI, they give a test result, and part of the booking process, the police are able, once they identify the individual, to access their criminal history. And so, yeah, in those criminal histories, it will say that they had a DUI, in 2008 in, Massachusetts or in New Hampshire or something like that. So that information is available to us.
So if a person picks up a DUI or an impaired driving charge and is convicted of it, how long does that stay on their record? Is that indefinite?
It depends upon the state. So I know that in Vermont, it stays on your record. It can be eligible to be removed from your record if a certain amount of time has passed and you meet some other qualifications. But there is no specific national standard about how long a conviction stays on your record. Every state's law is different.
Yeah. So if a person picks up a DUI here in Vermont, that's going to stay on their record unless they somehow is there any way to change it?
If you're under a certain age when you have the offense, and if you have a clean record for a period of years after, there's a statute that controls the process. Is called expungement, so you can have that portion of it wiped off your record. Although I think it's only certain kinds of DUI offenses, so the more serious ones can't be. But some of the earlier misdemeanor ones may be after a passage of time.
I know that if a person picks up a DUI here in the States, for a long time they could not get entry into Canada.
That's, I believe, is still the case. I don't do a lot of that because that tends to fall to defense attorneys who get a client who's very concerned about getting access to Canada after they have a conviction. But my understanding from them is that's always one of their concerns. I think it's a period of 5 years after your conviction that you're not allowed to enter Canada.
Okay, so after 5 years, are you automatically eligible, or do you have to apply?
I think there's a process by which you have to get permission again.
Okay. Do you work? Have you done a lot of work with our current Orleans County attorney, district attorney here, Jennifer Barrett?
Yes, I know Jennifer well, and actually one of her deputies and I are currently working on a series of DUI cases right now in your court.
Oh, okay. What do you feel is the toughest part of enforcement of DUIs and impaired driving?
Well, it's a high volume type of law enforcement. Murder cases are kind of the opposite, right? They happen somewhat infrequently, we hope, and those cases tend to get a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of devotion. DUI cases, it almost feels like they come to you on a conveyor belt or from a hopper sometimes. And so what you need is a really systematic approach to them, right? You need all of your officers to have the same training, and you need all of the people to take the same kind of test, and so we've built this system to handle them, but against that challenge, against that is the challenge that every case is different. You have to give it that kind of attention too. So, we've built this system that we use, and we have to watch for those cases that aren't quite right for the system, that would require more time, more attention, that sort of a thing. And of course, then, in Vermont, there's a lot of litigation in DUI cases, and so we're always in court opposite a defense attorney who wants very much to show why the system has broken down for his client and why the case should be dismissed. So there's always something new to be challenged, always something new to be litigated, and it requires a lot of attention and focus. That can be just against the volume of what we deal with. That can be a challenge.
You talked about specific training for officers to be able to detect drunk driving or drugged driving. And what does that entail?
There's a few different levels of it. Every officer in the state of Vermont who's a licensed, certified enforcement officer goes to the Vermont Academy in Pittsford, just outside of Rutland.
Okay, yep, I know where that is.
It's a multi-week training course, and one of the things they do is they spend a whole week on DUI enforcement. So they learn about DUI law, they learn about how our laws are applied, they learn about how they can make and get the best affidavits and cases and evidence for us in a case. They learn how to use the testing instrument, they learn sort of how, and then beyond that they learn how to detect and investigate impaired driving cases. NHTSA makes a manual. It's a couple hundred pages long, and it tells you basically everything you need to know as a police officer. What clues are you looking for in the driving? What clues are you looking for in their behavior once you've stopped the car? What clues are you looking for in their behavior once you've gotten them out of the car? That sort of a thing. So that's the basic academy level all the officers get. After 3 years, within 3 years of being certified, they need to attend and complete what's called the ARIDE course, which is Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement.
Okay.
That's sort of Academy Part 2. It's like the graduate course. That teaches you a lot more about drugs in addition to alcohol. The Academy is primarily an alcohol-focused course, although there is some drug driving information imparted. But ARIDE completes that and sort of takes those themes further. And then beyond that, there's one final certification level called Drug Recognition Expert. And there are currently in the state, it's about a month-long commitment. It's like a college class, and currently there's only about 42 officers in the whole state that carry that credential.
Oh, okay. And that's all over the state?
That is statewide, yes. We try to distribute them among the state as the population needs require us to.
I think what you brought up about the impaired driving, I'm actually quite surprised it took this long. I'll give you a very short story. When I was in college in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1970, two guys got pulled over for drunk driving, and they kept making them blow in the Alka-Sensor, and there was nothing.
Right.
And finally, the cop said, "I'll tell you what, we'll take you back to your dorm and we'll drop you off, but you got to tell us what's going on." So they brought him back, and they said, "Oh, we were taking benzos."
Right.
At the time, we called them Reds.
Right.
Okay. Well, they tried the same stunt in upstate New York, and they tested him for it, and they got caught. And to me, it's kind of, I'm wondering why this didn't catch on sooner.
So the drug recognition expert program actually came out of Los Angeles in the 70s. And
No kidding.
It was exactly the same problem you had talked about. There was officers that would see people, and at this time, LA had a lot of PCP. That was one of the drugs of choice.
Oh, yes.
And if you've seen someone on PCP, you know they're on PCP. They act pretty uniquely. But they would have all these people that would be acting strangely and driving terribly, but they would give them the roadside breath test and it would be nothing. It would be negative. And they knew that there was something going on, and obviously their suspicion was that it was drugs, but they needed a way to prove it. So what the officers did was consulted with local medical school personnel and scientific research and texts and journal articles. And they came up with a physical evaluation that a police officer can perform with the proper training that checks things like vitals, your pupil size, your pulse, your balance, your coordination, all the things that we know drugs affect. Because there is no breath test for a drug. We don't have that ability.
Right. You'd have to take a blood test if you wanted to really nail it.
Right. Although just saliva testing is now increasing. It's available as an option for use. But we haven't rolled it out here yet as a program.
I didn't realize that either. I have one last question, and this just sort of piqued. I just thought of this. This was in the newspaper. There was a woman that was nailed for a DUI. She had a .144, but the case was thrown out because a border guard is the one that arrested her.
Oh, I think I saw that article. Yes.
Yeah, and I guess border guards can't do that. Should the border guard say, should they have called the state police and let the state police arrest her or test her or whatever?
I'm not familiar with the case beyond what I've read in the paper, but there are certain Border Patrol officers who have a certification that permits them to do civil law enforcement.
Okay.
I think the issue in that case was whether that officer had that certification. And so that case is sort of a jurisdictional issue. You had a federal officer whose jurisdiction was really the border, here within the state of Vermont, making a DUI stop. And so that I think was really sort of the issue with that, was that this person wasn't necessarily permitted under Vermont law to
I think that's what I read into it, was the fact that this person wasn't certified. So in his case, he should have probably called for the state police?
If you're not a certified law enforcement officer, even though you're a federal agent, you're basically a civilian for our purposes here in Vermont. And so, I think the best course, from what I know, would have been to get another agency involved. Mm-hmm. But then again, I guess that gets into the issue of, if you're certain that this person is drunk and they're driving, should you really let them go on down the road? Yeah,
they probably should have stopped them and then called for help or something. But anyways, I won't get into all that. But I think that it's a serious problem, and it would be nice to see better coordination, because who wants this person out there with a .144?
I've had a very limited experience dealing with Border Patrol. I've only had a few cases. I had a case in Franklin County where a Border Patrol officer was permitted to make the stop that he made of a drunk motorist. But even the effort to get them to court is tremendous, because they're a federal agent. They're not a state witness. So if it's a local officer, I can pick up the phone and say, hey, would you be able to come to court next week? With this officer, simply because he worked for the federal government, there's a much longer process to work through that involved me on the phone with their attorney in Boston for the Border Patrol, trying to get permission to have him sent. And you've hit on a good point, which is that there's almost a wall between the two agencies.
I guess it boiled down to a federal agent without the proper training or certification can enforce federal laws, but I guess DUI is not a federal law.
It is a state law.
It's a state law.
That's correct.
And they vary from state to state.
Correct.
What do you feel would help you to do your job better? Do you think the public should be involved more or not?
I think the public has a good awareness of the issue, and I think that, I pick juries in trials, and I say, does everybody know the legal limit? And everyone shouts 08. And so everybody understands that. I think there's an understanding societally that alcohol and driving are not a great combination, and you really need to be responsible with them. I think our biggest commitment is always resources, and it's time. The courts take a while to resolve cases. all the people in our department have, you know, a lot of open cases pending with their name on them, and it's hard to get trial time. It's hard to get even into court to get legal motions resolved. Sometimes it can take months. You know, so I understand everybody deals with demands on their time and their resources, but I feel like that's constantly the issue that we seem to face, is just having enough people and enough hands on deck to deal with it.
Well, our time has run out, and I have to tell you, this was very, very informative, and I'm glad that you stopped by, and hopefully sometime we might be able to do this again.
Yeah, thank you for your interest.
You've certainly given me a lot of information. This is Terry DeFazio for Dial It Up, saying we'll catch you soon. Have a good day now.